Welcome to the Capital Light Assembly Podcast, brought to you by Edison Manufacturing and Engineering. Edison is your low-volume contract manufacturing partner for capital light assembly of complex mobility and energy products that don't neatly fit within traditional high-volume production. I'm Brandon Bartnick, I lead business development, and joined here today by Nic England, who leads our operations and supply chain activities. Nic, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Thanks for having me. Yep, like Brandon said, I work for Edison, and I'm in charge of the operations and supply chain here.
Awesome. Yeah. So the topic here. So first episode we had talking with Frank, who leads our engineering and program management, talking about quality. I think it'd be interesting to get your perspective from the supply chain and operations perspective, what quality looks like. So maybe let's start on the supply chain side, right? So for the type of builds that Edison executes, low volume, capital light, complex assembly, what does quality look like? What are the key considerations for quality from a supply chain perspective?
So when you're talking about the type of builds that that we focus on, they're going to be that initially they're going to be very, very low volumes. Overall, our strategy is for low volume, highly complex assemblies. So initially, we're going to get into those low volume builds from an engineering standpoint and really be able to understand what the requirement is from a customer standpoint. And I think that's first and foremost the main point of how we assess quality on the back end is you obviously have to have the correct inputs. So really working with our customer base and understanding what their requirements are initially up front is obviously key, as would be with any industry or any manufacturing process. But where we take over and we excel from an Edison standpoint is that we have the ability for us to be more intimate with that design up front. We are a partner that comes in very early on in the engineering phase, which allows us to not only focus on the quality of the off-the-shelf parts and the parts that may have been sourced already by the customer or parts that we need to source from more of a standard off-the-shelf standpoint. It allows us to work with the customer on those manufactured parts or those specialty items that maybe you can't find off the shelf. They have long lead times. Those are the items where we see the most opportunity from a quality standpoint. And it allows us to work very intimately with that customer right from the get-go. So it allows us to make sure that we know what the quality standards are, and we can set those expectations with our supply base. One of the things that Edison has the ability to do is manage the supply chain. So when customers find out that we have the capability to focus on quality to that degree, it also frees them up a little bit if they choose to move some of their supply chain to Edison. It allows us to get more in tune with what their quality standards are prior to even outputting one single unit of whatever that product or whatever that component may be for that specific customer. So I think the ability for us to do that up front and not wait allows us to really hone in on what the expectations are. And then that in itself is naturally going to create a product that is of higher quality and of higher standard because you're putting those expectations and those requirements in right from the very beginning. And that's one of the opportunities that companies have when they work with us is that level of detail right away. Those low volume builds and those complex assemblies that we choose to partner with these organizations for, it allows us to get in there, get dirty, and really understand what the requirement is. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but it allows us to make those recommendations. That's what our engineering team is there for, is to ensure that not only are we purchasing good components, are we receiving good components, but are we designing good components? Are we designing components that are built to last and have that high quality OEM standard?
Great. Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. And I guess one note just to point out so we mentioned low volume assembly is kind of that's what Edison does. And Nic, you're starting here, the even lower volume engineering. So when we're talking low volume, we're talking hundreds, thousands often of units, but early on it starts, as you mentioned here, with these engineering builds, which could be 1, 2, a handful, a dozen, something like that. And yeah, the importance of defining the quality perspective up front. So I'm glad you highlighted that. And I guess one follow-up question. So when we're talking, yes, it's really important to align upfront with our partners and collaborators when we're working. Can you say just a brief thought on, okay, there is an aspect of inbound quality, right? So we need to understand that the parts that are coming in are good and that they meet the requirements that have been defined. Can you talk to how we do that? Is it one size fits all, or how do we think about doing that for the different types of components that we are dealing with?
Yeah, there's definitely not a one size fits all, especially with the organizations that we choose to work with. Being able to have a very, very defined inbound receipt process and a quality inspection process obviously is the next step, right? Once you pass that engineering phase and you start having higher volumes into the facility or wherever you're choosing to manufacture that product, that is absolutely critical to the success of the operation. So from an inbound quality standpoint, we choose, like I said, we choose to work from the engineering phase with customers very early on so that we can set those standards. So not only are we harnessing the 100% inspection of all inbound materials, we're also harnessing the opportunity from working with engineering to ensure that those specifications are set. They're in our system, our ERP system, to ensure that on inbound receipt, we have the ability to assess whether a product that's been shipped from a customer, from a fabricator, from a supplier, a fabricator, a manufacturer, whoever we're choosing to get that part from, there's standards set in place. So as soon as that product hits the door, we have a game plan and we have an understanding of what the requirements are. And that's going to be on every single part that we receive, whether that's off the shelf, whether that's manufactured. Those inspection processes are going to look very different, but again, they follow the same criteria. And we do that for specific reasons. We know that being able to execute on whether it's one build or 100 for these customers is just as important as the next. So understanding that process and then building that process into our culture and our people is the next step, right? So making sure that our people on the floor and people that are our employees that are really taking part in the receiving operation understand our mission and how we are to achieve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we could talk for a long time about supplier and inbound quality and such. And I think that's a great kind of teaser here for this bite-size format that we're doing with this Capital Light Assembly podcast. And with that in mind, I think just one final question in this topic for sure. We're just going to scratch the surface here. Maybe we'll be able to do a deep dive sometime in the future. But talking about from an operational execution perspective, what specifically for the type of builds that we do first, right? Low volume, capital light, complex assembly. What are the key points or the differentiators or the main things that are important from a operational execution perspective when talking about the quality of the end product?
Yeah. So again, this is another thing that I love to focus on because when you look at a manufacturing process, large manufacturers have a lot of automation. They've got a lot of predefined processes that are built into the manufacturing process. But one thing that we focus on, and I think I've mentioned it already, that we focus on up front is our people. And we have the ability to do that. And we have the ability to put more hands on the floor and more interaction with our product and our quality because we choose to operate at a very, very low cost, capital light from an environment like that, which allows us to put more focus from a people standpoint. So, when you look at, your question today is overall based on quality. There's a couple things when I think of supply chain and operations and how they impact quality. There's one which is going to be the impact, and there's one that's influence. So, and I'll explain. But when I think about impact, I see this as the basics of inbound quality. Your supply base translates to preparedness, accuracy, and efficiency of your operation. Proper strategy and execution is going to support the level of quality that you inject into your organization, ultimately the level that you desire, right? So that gets us to having that quality coming in the door. But then the next step, and I mentioned this just a minute ago, is influence, right? So when you look at influence, that's really tied to how we develop our manufacturing processes, and that revolves around training and employees and creating repeatable processes, which ultimately influences our output, right? And to the degree of quality that output is there. So we focus on consistency and behavior as the main drivers for a quality level and at a human level without automation, right? So that's the key for Edison, is that capital light mindset. Without that automation, we're able to drive OEM type processes in quality control because we choose to take those processes up front during that engineering phase, during that pilot build phase, and focus on how do we create a better process for that individual to go out and complete that process. Mm-hmm. We don't focus on automation up front, which ultimately could lead to some missteps down the road. So we focus on the people, the processes, and that allows us to achieve that OEM level of quality while maintaining, the intimate nature of a hands-on capital light approach. Awesome. That's really what it comes down to, Brandon.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think that's a teaser here, right? Given the time, but I think that's a great overview. Really appreciate it. Yeah, from this supply chain operations perspective, appreciate your thoughts on what quality means to us and how we execute there. So yeah, appreciate you joining, everyone. Appreciate you tuning into this edition of the Capital Light Assembly podcast.
Great. Thanks, Brandon.